The release of Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild in 2017 was a monumental event in all of gaming, innovating upon one of the most famous game series of all time and influencing game design at large, with games adopting Breath of the Wild's approach to open world. It received 10 out of 10 scores from virtually every game review company and an incredibly warm reception from fans. However, one aspect was not widely appreciated: its soundtrack. The specific complaint was that it felt lacking, both in relation to the monumentality of the game itself and in relation to the soundtracks of past Zelda games, which featured epic and memorable music. Across the discourse surrounding the soundtrack's quality, a certain perspective arose in its defense. Breath of the Wild's music mirrors its gameplay innovations by moving away from past conventions and exploring an impressionist style of composition. This particular video by YouTuber Pixelty states the perspective clearly. Past Zelda games can be fit into the Romantic era of music history. In contrast, Breath of the Wild is the Zelda series' first venture into the Impressionist era of music. I believe that this labeling of Breath of the Wild soundtrack is inaccurate, specifically because the idea of Impressionism carries with it a large swath of artistic goals and priorities that are not entirely aligned with the creative goals of video games. I want to explore the matter with further nuance by looking at the aesthetic of Impressionism, the functions and purposes of video game music, the impressionist sounding qualities of Breath of the Wild's music, the soundtrack's traits that do not fit into an impressionist aesthetic, and how Breath of the Wild synthesizes impressionist sound with narrative goals. All of these factors give cause for a slightly more accurate label to give to the soundtrack of Breath of the Wild. First, let's do a brief review of Impressionism, its priorities, and how it is manifested in art. Impressionism is a movement in art that prioritizes capturing visual impressions naturalistically with great accuracy, such as the play of light over water. The movement began in 1874 at an art show in Paris and developed through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it was a reaction to the rigid rules of late Romantic art establishments. Impressionist is characterized by its loose and visible brushstrokes that create a unique texture which captures the essence of a subject rather than capturing every small detail. Blurred lines that do not create a harsh distinction between objects, creating a fog-like effect, a focus on the play of light, distinct colors and tones that can be mixed by the viewer's perception, and everyday mundane subjects such as a stroll in the park, rather than historic, religious, or classical subjects of Romantic painting. The term Impressionism was coined in a scathing review of the debut art show. Critics believed the paintings were unfinished and sloppy, and considered their use of color vulgar and did not like their visible brushstrokes. Impressionist paintings are an influence in the art style and imagery of Breath of the Wild. The Impressionist movement's gravitation towards depicting mundane scenes fits especially well into the context of Breath of the Wild's world, as the game is set in a world that has been left in ruin by calamity, and most of its populations hidden away in settlements, thus leaving ample amounts of nature without people and dramatic action. The game's vibrant colors resemble the distinct colors of Impressionist paintings. The animation's use of cel shading, which is an animation technique that leaves distinct shades of color instead of blending shades into a gradient to be realistic, creates a similar effect as the visible brushstrokes of Impressionism. While the imagery of Breath of the Wild shows resemblance to Impressionist paintings, how does this idea of Impressionism translate to its music? It is important that we look at the works of the composer who is largely associated with the beginning of the Impressionist movement in music, Claude Debussy. Debussy was a French composer who was reacting to the same social influences that inspired the Impressionist painters. He was faced with a rigid rhetoric in his art form, as well as exceedingly dramatic composers like Mahler. In his works, we see Impressionism take the form of static harmony that de-emphasizes time and emphasizes space, creating a harmonic blur through the use of non-traditional pitch collections, a prioritization of distinct colors and textures over form, a lack of drama or narrative in the same way that Impressionist painters do not depict scenes of action, subjects that do not feature people, and a greater interest in sensory experience rather than subjective feeling. Debussy, like the Impressionist painters, sought to represent the everyday experience of the world around him. For this discussion, it is important to know that Debussy never explicitly described Impressionism as an influence in his works. It was a label attributed to him because of his proximity to the movement and how the unique sound of his music worked well with Impressionist ideals. In fact, the label of Impressionist has actually been given to the works of other great composers who did not purposely create Impressionist-sounding music. Most notably is Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, which was hailed by few music critics as an attempt to paint the sensual world, despite it following a long tradition of program music where sound is used to suggest pictures or the composer's emotion. Beethoven personally wrote programmatic subtitles to suggest scenes and emotions for the orchestra to portray. To think of Beethoven as Impressionist is especially odd, as he is regarded as the figure who laid the groundwork for the Romantic era, from which the Impressionist movement wanted to break away from. I believe that a similar thing is happening here with the Breath of the Wild soundtrack. Perhaps the musical devices used in the soundtrack align with an Impressionist sound, and some do, but I think it is equally, if not more important, to consider the values and goals of video game music to further clarify this matter. Before we examine the music of Breath of the Wild, it is important that we go over how music fits into video games. In Karen Collins' Game Sound, an introduction to the history, theory, and practice of video game music and sound design, she outlines helpful categories when thinking about video game sound and lists some of the purposes of audio in video games. Collins outlines video game audio as falling into one or multiple of these categories: diegetic or non-diegetic, linear or adaptive, and interactive. Sounds that are diegetic exist within the world of the game, and sounds that are non-diegetic do not exist within the world of the game. Basically, sounds that the characters can also hear versus sounds that the characters cannot hear, but the player still can. Background music can be considered non-diegetic, and then become diegetic if an on-screen character begins singing along to the track. The distinction between linear and adaptive audio is caused by the player's ability to control, to varying degrees, the events happening on screen. In instances like pre-rendered cutscenes, where the events are set and the player cannot affect those events, linear audio is played. Conversely, adaptive audio can be affected by the player's actions, such as allowing time to pass and the background music changes from a day version to a night version of the track. Interactive audio intentionally influences the player's experience, such as calm background music changing to a battle theme when the player is at risk of entering a combat state. Interactive audio can even be a main gameplay mechanic with games such as Rock Band, where the player takes an active role in the sound. In addition to those three categories, Collins also outlines typical game audio purposes and functions. Video game audio can be used to prepare the player for action, as sound symbols to influence the player's attention, with sound effects like footsteps, as sound symbols to help identify narrative goals, such as a recurring motive to remind the player of certain narratives, to create narrative structure by connecting cutscenes through continuous audio or signifying the end of a game state with silence until the player takes an action to continue the narrative, to reveal information through dialogue, to help the suspension of disbelief, and to communicate emotional meaning. Of the purposes listed, it is the suspension of disbelief and the communication of emotional meaning which are most pertinent to the debate over the soundtrack, as they give cause for similarities to Impressionist music as well as contradict Impressionist priorities. This first idea of the suspension of disbelief lends itself quite nicely to an Impressionist aesthetic. Video games approach this suspension of disbelief primarily through ambient music, which sounds in the background as the player engages with the game's world. Where Impressionist music aims to represent the sensation of experiencing the world, ambient music in video games mirrors this by attempting to create the sound of a world that helps the player believe they are in it. Essentially, ambient music in video games must ponder the question, what does it sound like to be in a certain environment? It is no coincidence that the tracks that serve this purpose are the same tracks which fans use in their argument for Impressionism in Breath of the Wild. Here is a track titled Field Day, which plays as the player explores the game's early areas. The track functions by playing the individual figures at random, perhaps punctuating discoveries that the player makes or even new sights that the player sees. This creates a lack of ordered form, which is a definite point in the Impressionist camp, as the music simply floats without action. The vague harmony does not strongly outline a tonic rival point or a chord progression towards a tonic pitch, but it does play around with the colorful sounds of the pertinent pitch collection. This is similar to Debussy's idea of creating a harmonic blur, where harmony isn't used to create tension, but as a way to explore color. Another related aspect I notice is the emphasis on space, simply allowing the music to explore the different sonorities. Finally, the lack of musical action or drama fits into an Impressionist angle, and it also fits the setting of the world. The areas where the player hears this track are largely devoid of people and even enemy monsters, mostly a serene landscape for the player to explore. However, this lack of action can be interrupted when the player does a notable action. Special sound effects can punctuate events like solving a puzzle or finding important items. Battle music can start playing as soon as the player draws the attention of enemy monsters. While the ambient track and the sound effects do fit into the Impressionist sound, the battle music which takes over does not. It features jarring sounds that evokes a fight or flight response within the player, eliciting either an emotional reaction to fight or a fearful emotion to flee. Another important factor is the field music of previous games, which fans used as a comparison point and gave the Impressionist label as a result. In Ocarina of Time's Hyrule field music, we hear a morning call played by an ocarina, representing the sunrise, and then are subsequently swept into motion by a sweeping ensemble run into a rhythmic orchestral track. The snare drum acts as the rhythmic engine, accompanied by chords in the low strings and brass. The form is outlined by the different motives that are developed. The track is solidly planted in the key of G with some mode mixture on the flat 7 chord that befits epic fantasy settings, as well as a chord progression whose drama is intensified through the use of some chromaticism. In Twilight Princess's Hyrule field music, we get a similar deal, except starting in the relative minor, the key of E minor. This track feels a great deal more serious because of its minor key, and also because of its higher quality MIDI files. The snare drum again acts as the rhythmic engine, while accompanied by chords in the low strings. There is an equal amount of motivic development in this track, denoting the form and carrying the player through its different sections. This is the sound that fans are acclimated to and inevitably compared against the music of Breath of the Wild. Why is there such a drastic shift in tone? As I alluded to in the introduction, Breath of the Wild represented a monumental shift for the Zelda series, going from a highly narrative-driven and linear experience to an open-world, choose-your-own-adventure setting. Where previous games would set you on a clear-cut path, Breath of the Wild gives the player a great deal of agency in terms of what to do. In fact, the very first objective that is imposed upon the player, and one of the very few deemed as a main quest objective, is simply destroy Ganon, which is the monster that caused the calamity and risks further destruction if left alone. Aside from that, the player is left to explore the world as they choose. The epic and linear music befits the music of previous games and their experiences, but as the game design shifts to emphasize a more open-ended structure, the music must reflect that in some way. Going back to Karen Collins' categories of game audio, this matter relates to the idea of linear versus adaptive audio. At its beginning, video game audio could function similarly to film music. As the technology developed, video game worlds became more complex and afforded many more possibilities to the experience, thus the way their music functions diverged. Film music is linear by nature, as it can be highly edited to fit the set narrative on screen, or vice versa with the visuals edited to fit the audio, and this can be seen in the previous Zelda games with very linear experiences. The player must complete the events of the narrative in a prescribed order, and the music is set to enhance that experience. Breath of the Wild's open-world structure allows a player to choose what they do. Because there is not a set order of events, the game designers cannot tailor the experience around a specific order of events. The ambient music reflects this in its open-ended writing and vague harmonies. In fact, all of the characteristics of Debussy's Impressionist idiom translate well to serve the suspension of disbelief. Assigning labels to help identify different-sounding musics is not an entirely useless thing to do, but when labels with aesthetic connotations, such as Impressionist, are used, it can cause more confusion. I will not deny the similarities between the ambient music of Breath of the Wild and Impressionist music. However, I believe that Breath of the Wild's similarities to Impressionist music are born from its gameplay structure rather than Impressionist artistic goals. As there is music to accompany the player's experience exploring the world, there is music that accompanies the narrative events of the game. In these instances, I find that the music serves the purpose of communicating emotional meaning and immediately do not fit into an Impressionist aesthetic. These tracks typically play when the game shifts into a cinematic cutscene and can function more like linear film music rather than adaptive game music. The songs that communicate emotional meaning are written in a more romantic style, utilizing traditional harmonies to create great deals of tension and enhance the emotional aspect of the game. In this respect, the Zelda series' most useful tool is its use of recurring motifs through the series' 36-year-long history. The most notable motif used in these emotional moments is the Zelda's Lullaby theme. To understand the emotional power of this theme, we must look at its history throughout the series. Each Legend of Zelda game follows the same general story structure, where Link, the protagonist, is called to action and undergoes his own hero's journey. At some point along the way, he meets Zelda, typically a member of royalty, and must rescue her at a later point in the story. Finally, he must prevail over the antagonist, who is normally a character named Ganon. Sometime during the sequence of events, the Zelda's Lullaby theme is presented, either at Link and Zelda's meeting or an emotional moment between the two. The theme first appears in A Link to the Past. Link is called to action by a telepathic message that awakes him from his sleep. He finds its originator, Princess Zelda, trapped in the dungeon of her own castle, following a betrayal by one of the king's advisors. He must fight numerous enemies to free her, and the theme plays to punctuate her liberation. The theme follows an AAB form, with the melody of the A section in a comfortable middle range, and then ascending in both range and emotionality leading into the B section. The melody and harmony imply the key of G major, but we never hear an emphasized perfect, authentic cadence at the end of phrases. The 5 chord at the end of each A section leads right back to the 4 chord. The melody of the first A section implies a 2-1 resolution, but instead it moves from 2 to 3 to continue the melody. In the second A section, the melody leads to the 5th of G in the higher octave and heavily suggests a 5-1 movement. However, the melody remains on the 5th, continuing into the B section, and eludes a perfect, authentic cadence. Both the A and B sections typically follow a 4-3-2 walk down, either leading to a dominant or a tonic in their respective keys. The A section can be analyzed in G, and the B section can be analyzed in C. The A section slowly progresses through the chords, with the 4 acting as a pedal for 4 bars under alternating 4 and 5 chords, before walking down to the predominant dominant movement. The B section accelerates this chord movement with one chord per bar. Neither of these sections resolve strongly to the chord they imply, resulting in an elusive final cadence which is similar to Zelda's typical roll through the series. In Ocarina of Time, a young forest boy named Link is awoken by a nightmare of a man in black armor chasing a young girl on horseback, who he soon discovers is Princess Zelda. The fairies of the forest lead Link to the Great Deku Tree, an entity that watches over the forest. Link is instructed to travel to Hyrule Castle to speak with the princess and further understand his nightmare. Upon his arrival at the castle, Link is denied a visit to the princess and must sneak in. He happens upon Princess Zelda idly relaxing in the castle garden, and as he approaches her, the Zelda's Lullaby theme appears, calling back to Link's meeting with Zelda in the previous game. The theme appears largely the same here. One difference is the choice to keep the B section melody in the same octave that the A section melody ends in. This gives off the feeling that the B section is the emotional high point of the theme, which accentuates its faster harmonic movement. In Skyward Sword, Zelda's lullaby appears at Link and Zelda's emotional parting near the middle of the story. Link and Zelda begin as students at the Knight Academy of Skyloft, an island in the sky which is created by the goddess Helia to escape the destruction of the Demon King, Demise. Zelda is kidnapped by an enigmatic figure, and Link gives chase but is always a step behind. After he finally catches up with Zelda, she reveals that she is the vessel of the goddess Helia, and must use herself to steal the Demon King Demise until the chosen hero can muster up the strength to defeat the Demon King for good. The theme appears to highlight the emotional heartache of Link and Zelda's temporary parting. These are only a few of the many times a motive recurs in the series, but it proves that the theme is used specifically to emphasize the relationship between Link and Zelda. Now, how is this theme presented in Breath of the Wild?
Open your eyes. Open your eyes. Wake up, Link.
Link is awoken by a telepathic voice saying, "Open your eyes, Link, wake up." Upon his awakening, he finds that he has lost all his memories. As he explores the ruined world, he sees a castle enveloped in a strange aura with a beast circling it. Suddenly, the voice calls out again, telling him that he has been asleep for 100 years and that he must stop the beast before it is too late. As the player sees this, the track underneath plays the audio of a reversed piano, highlighting the unnatural quality of the sight. Then a low pedal tone sounds, with a wash of metallic, unnatural sounds following it. Through this texture, a 4-bar motif from the Zelda's Lullaby theme appears. It remains in its original key, but the setting around it produces an eerie quality. The motif sounds more like a cry for help, rather than a warm and happy song. Unlike the previous game's narrative structure, most of the important story events in Breath of the Wild actually happen before Link awakes from his slumber. To briefly summarize, Ganon, the incarnation of the Demon King Demise, initiates a calamity that throws Hyrule into destruction. Zelda, the incarnation of the goddess Helia, uses her power to seal Ganon in Hyrule Castle, but also herself in the process. This is the context in which the player first hears the Zelda's lullaby theme in Breath of the Wild. The appearance of the theme in this context helps the player quickly identify that in this setting of dark and mysterious evil, there is a small tinge of hope and happiness. The way Breath of the Wild tells its story is through Link recalling his memories of important events. The player must find specific spots in the world that jog Link's memories. As Link slowly recovers his memories, he also gains added purpose to the ever-present goal of destroy Ganon. In the next important instance of the Zelda's lullaby theme, Link recalls the events leading up to his coma. Link and Zelda attempt to flee the pursuit of the corrupted guardians serving Ganon, but they are eventually caught due to their exhaustion. Link fends off the guardians until he inevitably falls. All hope seems lost as the enemies slowly inch toward the pair and ready their weapons. In a last-ditch effort, Zelda reaches out her hand and awakens her power as a vessel of the goddess. In this moment, the Zelda's lullaby theme appears in the heavenly choir, punctuating the sense of salvation that she feels, knowing that she protected herself and Link. The use of the Zelda's lullaby theme helps a bittersweet emotion of this scene, with Zelda's sense of relief coming at the cost of Link's safety. After this scene, Zelda's allies aid in keeping Link from death, but he is left in a coma until he wakes up 100 years later.
Link, get up! You're just fine.
These tracks that focus on the communication of emotional meaning aid the on-screen narrative, and the use of a well-known motive only furthers the emotional impact. Relating back to Debussy's Impressionist artistic goals, Impressionism prioritizes representing sensory experiences over psychological and subjective feeling. I believe that this focus on eliciting emotion within the listener goes against Impressionist values and aligns more with the romantic music that Impressionists wanted to move away from. In terms of numbers, the tracks that serve the suspension of disbelief are outnumbered by the tracks that serve the communication of emotional meaning. However, the frequency at which the player hears ambient music instead of emotional music is one reason that some fans label the soundtrack Impressionist. While both types of tracks exist on the soundtrack, there is also music that combines both functions of suspension of disbelief and communication of emotional meaning, notably the Riding Day track, which plays whenever the player rides on horseback in the open world and is not in combat. There is a lack of harmonic motion that fits well with Impressionist music. The left-hand A-flat bass pedal, with an alternating treble E-flat and B-flat, or F and B-flat, creates a carpet for the right hand to float over. These notes do not feel like they strongly imply a key, but rather explore the colors of the pitches when sounding simultaneously. The rhythmic activity implies quick motion, like on horseback. While this is happening, the Zelda's lullaby theme in augmentation slowly swells in the strings, reminding the player of Zelda as they explore the vast world. This track encapsulates the entire debate quite well, in that there are impressionist qualities as well as expressive and emotional qualities to the soundtrack. It is inaccurate to portray it as entirely one or the other when both are present in substantial amounts. After looking at the musical idiom of Impressionism, the functions and purposes of video game music, the ambient music of Breath of the Wild that sounds like Impressionist music, the emotional music that inherently contradicts Impressionist aesthetic, and how Breath of the Wild synthesizes both types of music to serve a narrative goal, I now propose the label of part-time Impressionist soundtrack. It better represents a subject at hand, though I will admit it does sound rather corny, and I am open to suggestions.